Hi, and welcome to episode 312 of the Untethered Podcast. Today we have Dr. Julia joining us. Dr. Julia is the founder of Oris Wellness, a consulting company dedicated to empowering parents with the knowledge and confidence to make informed decisions about their child's oral and airway health. Through one-on-one sessions, she provides objective guidance on treatment options and helps families connect with qualified airway-focused providers. Her mission is to bridge the gap between professional expertise and parental intuition. Originally trained in biological and airway dentistry in Chicago, she now calls Portugal home. Quick disclaimer, all information, content, and material of this podcast are the opinions of the speakers and is for the informational purpose only and not intended to serve as a substitute for the consultation, diagnosis, and or medical treatment of a qualified healthcare provider. Welcome to the Untethered Podcast. I am your host, Hallie. I'm a certified myofunctional therapist, feeding specialist, podcaster, business owner, and mentor. This podcast is all about getting your questions answered and collaborating with colleagues to bring you the most up-to-date information in the orofacial myofunctional therapy, airway, tethered oral tissue, and pediatric feeding therapy space. If you're new here, I challenge you to keep an open mind and join my mission to spread this message far and wide. If you've been around since June 2019, thanks for being a loyal listener. As we jump into today's episode, remember to listen with correct oral rest posture. Tongue up, lips closed, teeth apart, breathe through your nose. Let's get started. Dr. Julia, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
I'm excited to chat and dive in. I know that you're in Portugal now, and we're going to talk all about that with my upcoming trip this summer. But let's dive into why we're here today. All things, airway health and your framework and all that fun stuff. But before we do, tell us, how did you, because I know we all have a story. How did you go from, general dentistry to biological dentistry and ultimately into the airway space that you're in now?
Yeah. So I think my journey is a little unconventional. I know that most of us end up in this space from the personal experience, the trials of trying to figure it out for our own children. But in my case, this is a different scenario. I really fell into right place, right time when I moved to Chicago. So up until then, I had been practicing regular general dentistry for a few years out of dental school. And I relocated to Chicago and ended up finding my way by pure happenstance into what is a biological dental office. And I showed up, honestly was like, I don't even know what this means. And I was really fortunate to find my then boss and first mentor kind of took me under her wing and started to teach me all about that world. And that's the first tumble down the rabbit hole, right? Because then you start to reconsider everything you see and look at everything with new eyes. And then from there, I was introduced to Dr. Kevin Boyd, and I had the pleasure of becoming his research assistant for a period of time, working on some of his research with anthropology studies with the skulls and helping out in his clinic. And obviously, there was a lot to learn there. And in both of those settings, really the importance of sort of interdisciplinary care came into play much stronger than it had been in my general dentistry practice previously. So I really started to rely on having an amazing team of other providers from different medical backgrounds, not just within dentistry, to rely on. And I was so fortunate that in Chicago, we have so many incredible providers to rely on. And it wasn't really until I have some nieces that live in Florida, and I started first by helping them track down some providers. I started to realize that not everyone had this Chicago level system in place as far as having it all, the whole kind of ecosystem of care already in existence. So that was for me kind of the first light bulb. And then as I was making the decision to move to Portugal, I was trying to think about sort of what I really wanted my focus to be moving forward. And I had really loved what I learned with airway dentistry and loved educating families about kind of connecting the dots. I often joked that I was like a professional referral system at that point because I was screening and seeing these families and recognizing these kids early and sending them to all the right providers. And I started to realize that there were a lot of parents who were kind of looking for help and support in those areas. And so slowly and surely, I kind of dived into having my own consulting business to really offer that sort of education and support. So that's how I landed here with my own company, Oris Wellness, that is doing just that.
I love that. I love that. And you really, I mean, I love the journey. Yes, Chicago has such a great hub, if you will, even like in the suburbs outside of like, Chicago. Cause I have some friends in that area and even, in downtown Chicago area. And it's such a hub. I feel like we started to develop that where my practice is in the DC metro area. I moved to South Florida and was like, okay, there's like piecemeal providers and you have to drive a distance, and traffic down here is no more fun than I'm sure Chicago and the DC area. And I was like, oh goodness. And so, I mean, I'm very lucky because we've had now one airway dentist and now an airway ortho for my kids. The ortho is actually 10 minutes from my house, which is like, holy cow, because we drive over an hour to the airway dentist before, for expansion purposes, airway purposes. And I was spoiled because up in the DC metro area, my friend up there, she was also like 10 minutes from me, and she was a biological dentist in the airway space doing expansion and all the things. And I'm just like, I think I'm just going to fly back up to get my teeth cleaned by you because I can't find a replica of you down here. Yeah. It's hard. And then even on like the myo side of things, right? So I love that you've kind of like, you're mentioning you're doing the consulting and you've really evolved into supporting the parents, because as a parent in this space, it's overwhelming. And it took me time between finishing expansion like that we did before and knowing my kids needed another phase of it and going to this next provider. We just went last week and she has been on my to-do list for, 7 months. And, so it's like even someone in this space, I get it. And the overwhelm is real. And I think part of it too is just all that information just on top of our daily lives and everything we're already juggling. It's just it feels like a lot. So will you talk a little bit about like what you're doing to help parents kind of maybe overcome the overwhelm, or like, what is it that you do with this?
Yeah, I think you perfectly described that. That's exactly where so many parents just get stuck. They know they want to do something and take some action, but there are already just so many decisions to be made about everything in life, not just about this. And then this starts to feel like there's more and more pressure to sort of make this decision, make it right. I know that a lot of parents come to me so worried about taking the next step and taking that next action item. So that's really my consulting services have evolved in time as I've understood better what it is that the parent experiences, because I actually don't have any children myself. So much of what I've done is just try to be the professional lens in this equation and provide. I know a lot of families, the indecision and the overwhelm comes from a few places. So I think first and foremost, it's coming from inconsistent messaging that is out there. And so that's a function of the inconsistent training that is available as well. You go to the institutions that offer education for dentists and for hygiene and other dental school services are not the source of this education. And so these education items, they have to be piecemeal, like you just kind of were referring to. They really have to come from different organizations. And part of that means that there are professionals learning this system from this school or this system from this school and this organization. So I do think that is one reason why parents start to feel really overwhelmed. And so originally I set out kind of with the mission of trying to catch a lot of the parents that maybe were in the early phase. I wanted to make them aware of those red flags and connect to more parents and educate with that. But the reality was the parents who were finding me in most cases had already met several providers and were just unclear as to which type of provider they should be seeing, which type of treatment they should be pursuing. And so that is where I started to realize I could be more help and benefit, is just by sort of offering a sounding board and a more neutral professional lens, because people are always scared they're being sold to. And that's one of the things that I do feel like in this airway dentistry niche, at the very least, people are in it for the right reasons. I know you can make that generality or that kind of general statement, but I do believe that most people are here wanting to help. But that aside, there's still a huge financial investment that goes into most of these treatment plans, and they're complex. It's not always one stage. A lot of times it's working with ideally various providers. And so just making sure that parents feel more confidence in the next steps that they're taking.
Yeah. No, I love that. And I think you spoke to the dental side of it and like not being educated from these larger institutions, maybe in dental school, right? And I think the same thing then happens amongst many of these other professionals on the team too, like the SLPs, the myotherapists, whether there's OT or a body worker or whoever's involved. I think a lot of us didn't learn this stuff in school. And so it's not just even the dentists, right? They're hearing different things from different dentists, but they're hearing different things from different speech pathologists or OTs or RDHs who may be doing myotherapy. And I think it's just like, why so much conflicting, information? Like we get that question all the time. And it's funny that we're talking about this because I actually was working on a little product for professionals to educate families. And it's just like this little back end thing that people get when they enroll in something else. But, it was literally a script. Like, this is what you can say to families to explain to them why their pediatrician might be saying X or, and you're saying Y, and to kind of reinforce this and maybe encourage them to get another opinion, but maybe you help direct them towards where they want to get that opinion, because just going to another pediatrician or another ENT that doesn't have that same background is not going to help, And so it is so common that we hear this, like, well, and one of my favorite things when I was, I'm not treating right now, but when I was, like, parents would come to me and they'd be like, well, why is it that you're like the expert in tongue ties and feeding and myo and da. And I'm like, well, because that's who lands in my office at this point. I'm so highly specialized. They're like, well, why is it that you're so confident about what you're telling us? And I'm like, look, nobody has a crystal ball. We can't tell you for sure what's going to happen if you do absolutely nothing, but I can tell you what's present today. I can tell you what I think might happen. And then it's ultimately, up to you to then have conversations with other team members for us to all come together. And then you make the decision as the parent as to what feels best for you, right? Like, I will never push anybody into anything. I want you to feel informed, educated, empowered, and then you do you, no judgment. So it's such an interesting conversation because, I just feel like it comes up all the time. And I remember like just, especially in my early days, being challenged especially by like some moms would come with the kids. They'd be like, I feel so heard. Like, we're good. And then dad would get on the phone or dad would come to the next appointment and grill me and be like, well, why should I listen to you? And this provider said that, and that provider said this, and you said this. And I'm like, I can't take responsibility for what anybody else says. I can only tell you what I know from my experience, my education, but to the same degree, I'm like, I get it. I get being that confused parent who's like, why is nobody on the same page? Like, I'm supposed to invest all this time and money. Like you were saying, it's an investment and no one seems to be speaking the same language here.
And I think you hit on such an important point there too, with sort of, that's one of the things that I circle back to is, we can educate them on what we know, but at the end of the day, there's still a very big step that has to be taken by each parent to make the informed decision of what does feel like the next step and what does feel aligned for them in terms of what they feel is possible with whatever set of circumstances they're dealing with right now. Like you mentioned, the drive to see a provider. Maybe it's strictly the drive time. Maybe it's, finding the time to get to and from the appointments. There's a variety of factors. And even with kind of knowing which type of approach to take first. I mean, I certainly, in an ideal world, everyone would be doing myofunctional therapy and getting that done. But the reality is not every family is going to be a good fit to take that as the first step. So we do have to meet the parents where they're at and listen to their, there's guidance and there's education that we can give them in terms of making the best decision of what will be the best treatment outcome. But at the end of the day, it's not always going to be what I think is best. It is going to be helping each family figure out what feels doable and what makes them able to take action. If they've been stuck because they've heard that they need to do one step first and maybe that's just not working for them, then we need to find another path forward.
Yeah. No, I love that. I love the whole like family first, patient first, very individualized approach. And just it's, when talking with younger therapists or therapists who are newer to a space, sometimes like they'll say, well, how do you get the families to do what you want them to do? And how do you get them to do this and that? I'm like, I don't get them to do anything. I help get their buy-in. So I help them understand what we're doing and why we're doing it, because then they have a foot in the game and they are interested in doing it and they want to see the child succeed. Right. And like, people say, well, how is it you get people to keep coming to Maya? Or like, they don't stop seeing you and they see you through the end of the program because they understand why they're here in the first place. They understand what we're working towards and we're a team. If we're constantly just prescribing things, I have families come to me. In fact, I had somebody in my messages the other day who was like, well, I stopped taking my kid to Mayo because we were like 4 sessions in and they were just having them rub their lips together and like pop their lips. And I was like, okay, well, I'm like, I don't know what this person was doing or why. So I was like, well, did they tell you what they were like, why they were doing that? What was the goal? I'm like, I don't know that this is an exercise that I would use necessarily. Maybe I use half that, but not, but that's like one of many things. So here I am in my mind going like, what could they possibly be doing? And why were you working on this for 3 sessions? And the parent didn't know. They were like, I have no idea. I was not understanding how this was going to help us move forward. And I was like, that was the disconnect. This parent was like, I'm not spending my hard-earned money and my time doing something that makes no sense to me, that I don't know why we're doing it. I'm not seeing how it's going to help my child move forward. And it just kind of lends to this discussion that this parent was not properly educated. And so they didn't feel that it was valuable, right? And people are going to invest in what they value. So if we don't find value in what someone's doing, you're not going to keep them if they even start.
Absolutely. It's so important to find what motivates like each parent and each patient to either see immediate progress if that's what they're looking for. Yeah. And I know immediate progress isn't always available, but whatever we can do,
that's right.
to set them up for like, what is the biggest area of concern or maybe the biggest symptom that they want to address? Because if we can hone in on that and maybe work towards what's going to address that symptom, then I do think that buy-in is going to be a lot better as they see how that makes changes in the health of their child. And if we can start with one visible win and one step that is showing improvement, then we can get more buy-in.
100%. I love that you said that, like a visible win, even if it's small, even if it's just like, hey, I'm just trying to help your child do X, and they do that little movement with their tongue, or, it's like, oh, okay, progress, right? And I think it's just psychologically, like parents need to feel like we're making progress, which we are, but we're not always pointing it out. We're not always explaining it to like the 10th degree. And just helping them realize that this is part of the bigger picture. Like we're working towards X, but we have to like break it down into little steps in order to get to that end goal. I think that really helps parents kind of like grab on and hold on. And, I like to always assign like my homework is usually something that they really succeeded with in the session that we're going to then work on generalizing at home, because if they already had success and the parent knows that we had success, they feel more empowered. They're like, okay, you did this in therapy. We can try and do this at home, work on generalizing it. And they understand again why we're assigning that. And they're going to have less frustration at home because the kid already had success in therapy, or the parent, the adults, if we're working with adults, So anyways, I'm sure we could probably share like 500 different strategies here, but I know you have a framework. You got your smile support stair steps framework. Will you talk a bit about that? Like, what is it? How you developed it? What does it do?
Glad to. So again, that was a more recent development of mine. I was, again, as I realized more and more parents were really trying to understand what are exactly the nuances between why they might be choosing one type of treatment or another. It started to occur to me. It's taken me a long time to even understand as a dentist what some of the nuances are between these different approaches. And so I was trying to think about it. And what I really see as a difference is as we move through, I've got sort of 3 categories, we'll say. The entry point is the natural nurturers. Then we move on to the guided growers, and then the foundation fixers. So as we move from one end to the other, I will start by saying I do believe that there's a place and time for all of the dental and allied health professional treatments that are coming into play in this framework. And again, going back to like, what's the right thing for each family? That's what we have to figure out. And so as we move through each category, we really start in a place where there are certain treatments that may be less forceful, more natural, but with that becomes the reality of a higher degree of less predictability. So we might have the more natural approaches that someone's interested in. And I think that includes therapy. I think that includes a lot of the preformed appliances that are on the market. There are so things like the tooth pillow, the myo brace, things of that nature. There are a lot of parents who are first seeking, what can we do either early on when maybe no one else is seemingly providing options for my child. So a lot of the recommendations that I have for families that are looking for what can we do early on will fall into those categories. But a lot of parents have a preference for that. And I think, again, that if that's your preference, that is totally fine. But I need you to know that it's going to be less predictable than some of the things. As we apply more force, we're going to also see a greater degree of predictability in how the treatment results happen. So as we continue into maybe the guided growers, we could have more things like removable appliances or some of the functional orthopedic systems, which I'll explain a little more about too, because that's not as common in the US. So we can talk a little bit about globally what's going on too. But yeah, there in the beginning, a lot of people have questions about things like the alpha appliance, and that would be more aligned with like a natural nurturer approach. Whereas we can move through, and then even up to the foundation fixers, we're going to have, that's where things like braces are going to fit in. And I hear a lot of families say, I don't want to have braces, or I don't want my kid to end up in braces. And braces are just the tool. Braces are not necessarily the enemy here. We have to look at the fact that the reality is a lot of people think that because a lot of the providers who use braces are prescribing to an older thought system. But there are people who are trained and qualified to use things like braces, or I put rapid expanders in that category. There are things that are going to apply a certain degree of force. And again, that's not necessarily bad. We just need to understand, is this a right fit for your child? And is the provider who's using these tools thinking about all of this within the right context? So that's kind of an overview of that system.
I love that. And I think that's super helpful to think of it that way. Because a lot of families will come to me, and I think parents, without really having a good idea, they kind of look at some of these things that are marketed on, Instagram, some of these guided growers, as you call them, these tools, especially for the earlier ones, they kind of look at it as a replacement. And I think that, well, maybe for some kids it might be, but for others, depending on the age, like you said, there's just unpredictable things that we don't know yet. But for many kids, I've seen that they, even if they start there, they then go into like a fixed expander or some type of other, hardwired appliance. And I think that it's a really great way to look at this. I like that you kind of put a framework behind it. Cause I think visuals and just like categorizing things in super cute names like guided growers. And, I just think that's the stuff that parents kind of go, oh, I get it now. Even me as a provider, if someone had said that to me 7-8 years ago, I would have been like, oh, I get it now. Whereas, I went into a practice that had a dentist and ortho, biological, airway centric, and they had an arsenal of different things that they use, like from the ALF to the DNA Vivos to more hardwired options, not hardwired, fixed appliances. Yeah. And so it was, I was like, oh, well, obviously they offer different things. So it's very individualized. This is really cool. But it's hard to find places like that. It's hard to even find a place that offers one of these things, let alone a mix of them. And so very luckily, the ortho that I just started taking to my kids to here in Boca, she was working with somebody else before, but she's recently opened up her own office. And very convenient, which is so nice. But she offers, a variety of these different types of appliances as well, which is really nice because we went in and I was like, I don't know if she's going to recommend Marpy for my kids or like a Haas that's fixed or a clear aligner or, I don't know, or a Myo bracer. I don't know where we're headed. But I know that she has also she's got a toolbox, and so I think it's very cool to see the differences and to understand more about the appliances. Cause we get asked that in my Myo membership, even like people are like, can you do a training going over all different appliances and what they're for and why someone might pick this one versus that one? And I'm like, I can bring in a airway centric provider to do this that moves teeth for a living. Cause I don't, but and we did that a couple years back. And I'm like, I'm sure we probably should do another one. Cause I feel like there's more things now on the market that have become, not that they're all new appliances, but they've become popularized in a certain way.
Right. Absolutely. And that was one of the things was I actually kind of conceptualized that system sort of behind the scenes. I didn't realize that that was something that I was sort of understanding where each parent was at. And I'm working on getting a more public facing little document where parents can take a quiz and see like, what's your airway style, or kind of have an idea better of like what might be a better fit for where to start with, and kind of going into more supporting information on each of the different like categories and what's available for each of those. So I know you're right. I even, again, as a dentist, when I first found my way into this, I know like at Dr. Boyd's office, they handed me a sheet of all the different appliances they were using. And I had been through dental school. It wasn't like I didn't have the basic training, but I looked at the list and I was like, this is all very overwhelming to me. So I think it's something that it's taken some time to really understand the differences. And I want to be able to support a lot of parents in figuring that out. But also one of the things that's been helpful is being able to also help other providers, whether it be some of the other myofunctional therapists or otherwise that are interested in learning more, that I can still kind of make some of those kind of supporting references for them to understand.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like it's also individualized, which is also why I think some people have a hard time when they find a provider who only does like one type of appliance. So like in those situations, or just in general, I guess, how does a family kind of figure out, aside from working with you, obviously, but like, how do they figure out like, what is the best fit for them provider wise, appliance wise? Like, I know we've talked about how it all needs to be very individualized. So how do they do you have any suggestions on how people figure out their best fit?
Yeah, I do think, again, kind of going back to that autonomy component. I've heard you say before, there's like mom intuition and there's a certain degree of that. And I think it's just sort of pairing that intuition. And that's something that I really had to learn more in the biological dental practice. I think we start out from dental school and we should be including patients in those treatment decisions from the beginning. That is something that we learn as a foundational concept. The American Dental Association does say that patients should be involved in these treatment decisions, but it's easy to kind of, as a provider, sit back and say, I'm the professional and, pass the wisdom out. Here's what you should do. And I think that comes from the intentions are good. The intentions are like, here's what you should do because it's what I think is best with my professional expertise. And not to disregard that at all, but we need to find that middle ground of the professional expertise meeting what the parents' preferences are. So part of that, again, we've sort of talked about what are the motivations, what are the primary symptoms, because I think, yes, I can tell you to go start with the tongue tie or start with the expander or start with the therapy. But at the end of the day, kind of knowing if you're like just sitting there as a parent, one of the primary examples, I guess, that comes to top of mind of like, scratch that, we need to backtrack and figure out something different is like when sleep is a hot mess, when your child is getting no sleep and looking for that quick win, like maybe we need to go chat with a sleep consultant first and like get some quick wins there while we're addressing some of the dental issues or while we're addressing some of the functional issues. And sometimes there's a wait list to get into the dental offices. So sometimes it's just figuring out like what are the options available and who can we go see. And I know, again, you said apart from what I offer, which is to sort of sort through all of that. But I think, geographically relying on a lot of the amazing directories and figuring out what's available near you is an important step. I know you have one of those amazing directories, so thank you for that. And then also, looking into different resources and trying to educate yourself on what is resonating. And that's where I think there's been so much I see a lot. I passively watch some of the Facebook groups and people come out saying like, this is what you should do. And you should absolutely do this first. And it doesn't sit well with me because these people are saying, I know it comes from a good place because they know they have the tool set to help somebody, but without knowing what's going on for each family, it's hard. It's a really hard thing to sit with. So
yeah.
I think you just have to figure out what is the first thing that you want to see and then figure out from there where we go with selecting a treatment that feels like it will address that.
Yeah. Well, and I just have this like word downloading into my brain, like just flexibility amongst providers, because, it's making me think back to like, what was it, December, maybe 2022 that I did this, or 2023? I don't know. I did like a one-time training inside of our membership, and I called it like it was like airway first or something before like, all this airway first stuff was coming out. And because everyone's always asking me, well, how do you determine like what you recommend to patients? Like what journey, like what should they do first? And I was like, that's something that I even struggled with myself to figure out what I should do first. And honestly, part of it just was what fit my lifestyle at the time, not maybe what was the best practice, what was best practice from a medicine standpoint. It was more like, look at Hallie handle right now. I did my expansion first, then I did my nose. And I'm like, I feel like I should have done my nose first. And that was totally an afterthought, but that's life. That's how it happens. And so this was also like me sharing, I think it was December 2022, because it was after I had like my ENT nose surgery and everything. And so everyone was like, we want an update. And I was like, all right, this is a great way to present this. So in there, I remember speaking about like different pathways to the same end goal, and how, we have patients who may present very similarly, but maybe they go ENT first, maybe they go to bodywork first, maybe they do myo first, maybe they get expanded first. And in a perfect world, airway should trump everything, right? Like I want your airway to be healthy. What is going to get us a healthy airway first? To that same token, the way we get there can look very different, because I think everybody, just from a medicine standpoint, everyone's like, well, there's got to be a step 1, a step 2, a step 3, a step 4. And I'm like, yeah, sure, in a textbook. But like, do we ever really do anything textbook? Like that's rare that you have like a textbook case. Like, no, we're working with humans. There's always deviation from what you learn in a textbook. So, that's where I love what you're saying, because I think it really speaks to that and talks about like all just, these nuances. Like we're working with humans and life. If you want people to ultimately do anything at the end of the day, like you said, you got to meet them where they're at and figure out what's best for them. So I love that you really highlight that, because I think it's just a really great reminder for professionals in this space and parents to even know, hey, we do think this way and we are here for you and we want what's best for you. And, so I always say, leave your ego at the door. Like you're not here to be, yes, they want you to be the best provider. That's why they're coming to you. But, you give them your expertise, you educate them, and then you let them decide. And people get their panties in a bundle where they're like, they're not listening to my recommendations. I'm going to fire this patient. And I'm like, hold on a second. Like, can you not make any more progress with them? Because maybe that's a reason to say, hey, I can't help you anymore. But if you can still make progress with them, even though they don't want a tongue tie release, even though maybe they're not going through expansion right now, like you can still help them, undo some compensations, gain some function, better their health. Why would you be turning them away? Like you're doing what you do because, this is, not everybody's going to come and do every single thing that you want them to do or that you think might be best in their case, right? Like we're all human. And then I try to remind people, like, put yourself in their shoes. Financially, time-wise, life is, before I, like to your token, same token with like not having kids yet, like before I had kids and I was working with families of young children, I was like, I can't say that I know, but at the same time, like I'm going to try and be very realistic in what I ask families to do outside of therapy, because I just don't know. I don't know what they're dealing with, but I also feel like less is more. If we ask them to do maybe a little less, maybe it'll actually get done, right? Let's try that out. And I felt like it worked really well for most of my family. So I kind of, even now that I'm a mom with kids, I try to still keep that same thing in mind. Less is more. Like even with recommendations following an evaluation, people want to put like 5 recommendations in of different providers to see. And I'm like, pump the brakes. I'm like, if you're telling them this is a 2-year treatment plan and here's everything that, maybe verbally share some of that, but also like, if someone came to me and said, you're going to need 6 different providers to help your child and it's going to cost you $50,000 in 2 years, I'd be like, you're out of your freaking mind. Now, I can't say I haven't spent that time or money at this point, but nobody came to me and said that I needed to do that from the get-go. I kind of was like figuring it out as I went along. And so it's all about, I'm like, you're selling. We're all in sales. Like, how are you promoting to these people, like what is best for their child? Maybe make like one recommendation. I screened your kid. I think they need further evaluation for X, Y, and Z. Period. Done. End of story. Then you eval and you're like, okay, I evaled your kid. I think, yes, we should do myo, but also you might want to see a body worker and a airway-centric dentist. 2 recommendations, nothing more. It's like, let's not completely overwhelm from the get-go because that's when you lose people. And like, it's too much. So anyways, I know I'm like rambling at this point, but
no, I love everything you're saying. So I'm eating it up. And I think it's all important for people to hear. Yeah.
I'm like, take note, therapist, because if you want your clients to come back, you want to actually help
On
them.
the flip side though, I've also seen some really incredible treatment plans where someone's like, well, this one provider just wanted to start with just an expander, but this provider is telling me I need the expander and the frenectomy and this and that. And like comparing those approaches too, I'm like, well, this office is maybe looking at things possibly more comprehensively. It's hard to know that situation too. But yeah, I think to your point, like there's a way to verbally provide that information without having the extensive contract that you sign this dotted line before we get started. Yeah.
Well, and also like know your parent, like know the family. If the family's, if the person is sitting there asking you, okay, like, and then what? And then what? And then what? Put that in writing, like put your 12, step treatment plan in writing because that parent needs it. If you have a parent sitting there looking at you like deer in the headlights, like read the room, be like, and I always tell people, I'm like, you can say like, these are the initial steps. This is the initial phase of the treatment plan. For additional phases, contact us or something, because it just tells them there is more without completely like overwhelming them. And, like to your point, like I just signed 2 contracts for my girls for further expansion. And there was discussion of like, they've had expansion already. This may just be a phase 1 kind of thing in our office. Maybe we don't need phase 2 because this might be enough because this is not, one of my kids, this is her 3rd round of expansion. She had an ALF. She had a Hyrax with forward growth on, upper and lower. And now they're going into another expansion. I like, they need a little bit more. And we want to bring the palate down a little. We want to bring the jaw forward a little bit more on one of my kiddos. And so, but the younger one has only been expanded once, and that was to get her out of airway crisis. That was our initial goal with knowing she's going to need more because she gets between 4 and 5. So it's like, I went in knowing this wasn't like the end all be all, but this was step 1. We're going to need a step 2. I didn't know what step 2 was going to be, but I also didn't need to know what it was at that time. I just knew, I just liked that I was primed for it.
Absolutely.
So I knew like, okay, now it's the time for step 2. She's 6, she's 7, just turned 7. I'm like, let's do step 2 now and get her, over the hump and get this airway completely healthy again. So yeah, I mean, it can be so overwhelming. And everyone asks me, they're like, well, did you take Lily for body work when she had her ALF? And I was like, no, it was the pandemic and everybody was shut down. And like, in a perfect world, I would have loved to, but I didn't. So like, I'm also a prime example of somebody who maybe would have.
The conditions weren't
like
in
it's
place.
Life takes over and kind of directs you sometimes. And that's okay, But anyways, all right, let's talk a bit about different global trends. So now that you're over there in Portugal, right? I know there's differences, and I get people messaging me online too who are like, hey, do you know anybody in this country, in that country? And I'm like, I wish I did. I really don't have a big pulse on like other countries, maybe a couple of people here and there. But I know there's differences in the approaches and all that. So anything you want to share on that topic between US and like Europe? Go for it.
Yeah, no, I think it's really fun. It's been a fun part of my journey to sort of get a little bit of a perspective shift. I think that one of the things that jumps out to me is I think that in the US, we have that mindset of like, if by the time we're taking action, we want it to be quick often. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of the treatments and philosophies over here in Europe tend to be a little more gradual and a little more slow. Which I think is interesting. And again, I think a product of the environment to a certain extent. I know recently I was listening to you had Dr. Wolf on talking about Nuvola, which is based out of Italy, which I think is a really interesting system. And there are other treatment options that I've come across. In large part, there's a dentist named Dr. Pedro Planas that I had never heard of before. And he influenced a very different philosophy of treatment. He was based in Spain, and I've come across a few different schools of thought that have embraced his teachings and philosophies. So one is sort of similar in concept to when you had the provider on talking about Nuvola, they mentioned the freedom appliance that's working to unwind some of the cranial strain patterns. So there's an entire book that I read called Dentosophy that's like kind of meant to, it's very superficial. It doesn't go into a lot of detail about the treatment plan itself, but I've had the chance to meet with some providers who are offering this type of treatment. And that's something that's available more readily, again, in Spain and some in the UK and some providers in France and Italy. But they're looking at these sort of different what looks like it would be almost like a myobrace, but it has more of a cranial component. And I think that's really interesting because that's one of the things when x-rays in general are kind of less commonplace around here, and especially CBCTs being less commonplace around here.
Okay.
So one of the really interesting things that I've seen is some providers, when they're treating patients, they actually have like a podiatrist that they work with and they scan the feet. And I've heard you say before so many times, I like hear your voice saying from the tip of the tongue to the tip of the toe.
Cool.
They take like foot scans to measure how treatment is going. And I think that's incredible.
Wow.
And then kind of going back to like the Pedro Planas system and philosophy, there's other systems. I'm enrolled this year in a training program here in Lisbon that's all functional jaw orthopedics. And that's most similar, I think, in theory to some of the BioBlock and some of those types of treatments, but it's a system based out of Brazil. And it has 23 different appliances in this one system that's all focused on like repositioning how the lower jaw relates to the upper jaw. So again, it's all very slow movement, which I think is a departure and perhaps why this isn't maybe as commonplace in the US yet. And that's one of the benefits that the Nuvola system has over some of these other approaches is that with the clear aligner therapy, sort of bridging the gap that allows for it to fall in kind of the middle between it's a little more force. As I was kind of breaking down the systems, it's a little more force, it's a little more precise than some of these systems on their own, perhaps. But that's one of the nuances that I think has been really fascinating is just kind of getting this global perspective.
That's very fascinating and so cool. Now, is Dr. Planas like of Planas tracks? Did he invent the Planas?
Yes.
Okay.
You hear a little bit about
my girls have had those.
Yeah. And so those, for people who don't know about those, the idea behind those, they're like little composite, like white filling material that's added onto the teeth that changes the function of how somebody is chewing and how they posture their mouth. And that can be enough on its own. You don't even need a full appliance in their mouth. You can just start with something like this to change how they function. And as a result, it changes the muscle patterns. And as a result, that changes the growth. So I think all of that's really incredible and not very commonplace from what I was understanding more in the US.
Yeah. So it's interesting because Dr. Barahol that I took my girls to in North Miami, when we moved here, she uses a variety of things. She'll use an ALF. She'll also do Hyrax with like a forward growth component that she customizes. So my older one was a good, age, basically, if you're going based on age to go in. She had the ALF. We had great expansion, but I was like, we know we need more. So she put her in upper and lower with like a forward growth component. And she put Planas tracks on both kids' teeth. And part of what she explained to me was she was like, this is to really change the bite pattern and to help develop those masseters and to help, I was just like, oh, okay. My younger one, she wanted to start her in a myo brace. And then, because she was 4 and I think she was like 3.5 when we started talking. When I finally started it, had just turned 4. And this kid had croup for 9 times as a 3-year-old. They were constantly putting her on meds. I was also like switching into the homeopathic world. It's like, in the beginning of the pandemic, I was like, we've got to get this kid off steroids. It is destroying her gut and her entire immune system. And I was like, I know she's basically an airway crisis. And, we did CBCT and it confirmed it. Okay. Like we kind of knew that. So when I told her about her history, she was like, oh, no. Like she's like, I would rather do some rapid than slow on her just because, we know there's research that says like kids who are in airway crisis, like rapid is probably a good option. Right. So we put her in the rapid. It went beautifully, but she also is a kid who was grinding her teeth down like crazy, which my older one never did. And I mean, I was over here like, does she have parasites? Is it an airway thing? Is it everything? Is it like all the things combined? Like, what is happening? And so she put the Planus tracks on, which I feel like that was something that gave me the most peace of mind out of the entire treatment plan, because I was like, if she's grinding the Planus tracks. And I know that she's not destroying her teeth. Plus, she supposedly is changing her bite for the better right now. Plus, we're building up the jaw and the muscles in between them and everything. And so I feel like that was a saving grace for her, those Planus tracks. So they were like my most favorite thing of the entire treatment plan. And we've gone back where she's built them back up, over the past several years. And again, it just gives me peace of mind when my kid gets sick and she's like grinding away at night. And I'm like, because we had switched to using the myo brace more like a placeholder for both kids after. And Mia, my younger one, was like fantastic with wearing it and all night, every night, until it like broke. And like within days of like the white thing kind of poking through and me like poking it back through, it started to get moldy. And I was like, okay, now we have a whole host of other issues. This is we got a new one.
The trade-off on that.
Yeah. I was like, we got a new one. I bought a new one, full price, and then never used it. So that was a waste of money. And my older one couldn't keep it in her mouth. Like she was coughing, gagging, choking it out every night. And I was like, this is not good for her nervous system or anything. Sure. So I was like, okay, we're probably going to go into another round of expansion because I'm sure we're going to lose some if we're not using the myo brace, but I would rather do that than have her wear something that her body's literally gagging out 2 hours into sleep. Something is not working for her. So it's just been so fascinating to me to like have now had exposure to all these appliances through my kids. Myself, like I had a DNA Vivos appliance for a couple of years and then went into Invisalign. I need more expansion. My midline is off. And so that's a whole other conversation to have with Dr. Koval, who we're seeing here in Boca now, because she works with adults too. But man, I will tell you, it's so fascinating. So very fascinating to see all these different appliances, to have now had experience with some of them. But fascinating too, to hear about like how everything's different in Europe. So it doesn't surprise me.
Yeah.
Surprise me. But so cool, because it never occurred to me that like Planus tracks were from somebody with with that name, Planus.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And I'm over here like writing his name. And I'm like, I've got this guy up.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting because I really hadn't heard his name or come across his name when I was looking at things that were based out of the US, and here multiple systems are like, oh, Dr. Pedro Planas, and the way that it just, they're really looking at the way that the jaw moves in a different way. And I love that.
Yeah. And that's part of why I loved like the whole concept of the ALF appliance in the beginning, because the whole like not locking your body up and allowing the sutures to move, and all the fluids can move and everything can, integrate the way it's supposed to, and da, 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 da. And I was like, and I actually think it was really helpful for my oldest when she had it, because she was kind of like a sensory kid. Like I was like, I don't know how she's going to do with something in her mouth. And I think that appliance like really just helped her kind of like her whole nervous system just like was like, we're good.
Yeah.
After she had it put in, I was like, this is pretty cool. It's up there because her tongue's not yet. So I like this for us. So yeah, I do feel like different appliances definitely serve different purposes too, which is kind of cool when you get into the nitty gritty of it. But anyways, so
yeah. I think those are great examples to highlight, again, why certain appliances are maybe right for certain kids at different times. And yeah, I love that you shared from your personal experience. You've learned so much about that too.
Yeah. Well, that's what I tell everybody. I'm like, this is totally like my personal experience. Yours could be totally different, but also if a provider's recommending something to me, like I want to know why. I want to know what their reasoning is behind it. If you give me a reason, I will probably sign that contract and give you my credit card right there. But if you can't tell me why we're even doing this, like I'm going to go get another opinion. And I did take Lily to another like very highly regarded orthodontist, actually two in Boca. And before we started with Dr. Bearhill, I was trying to keep us in Boca where we live. And one of them was just very old school, very well renowned. Like, you know, people love him. And I was just like, not the treatment plan I was looking for. So not for me. Went to the second one, super airway centric for like US standards type of, you know, eval CBCT in office, pulled it up on the screen, went over everything, talked about all the things. And then that ortho proceeded to basically shit on every single person in the airway space that I knew, all, you know, oh, I've taken all those courses and this, that, and the other, and was basically like, let's just do a normal expander and braces. And I was like, super airway centric eval, zero airway centric on the treatment plan, and said in front of my kid, like, you're going to fatigue her. You don't need, you know, let's wait a year. I think we should pull those lower central incisors, when his dental colleague was like, nope, don't pull those. Like, you know, our dentist like, don't pull those. They will come out. He was like, her tongue will push the teeth forward, you know, after they come out. And I was like, well, we don't really want the tongue to do that. But I don't disagree with you based on where her tongue currently is. I don't like that this is the advice, though, but we're going to roll with it. It's fine. And that is exactly what happened. So he wasn't wrong. But the ortho was like, her face is so beautiful. You don't want to mess that up. And he said that in front of my kid. And I was like, I don't care if you're the most airway centric provider to say something like that in front of a 6-year-old.
Yeah.
Like, we're done. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. And he knew I was mad. Like he called me a couple hours later to like, be like, hey, just want to make sure we're okay. And do you have any questions? And I'm like, you know, I'm not okay. You know, I left there not happy because I was grilling him.
Oh my gosh.
But yeah, it was just, yeah. Anyways.
No, I think that, again, I think it's really helpful for people to hear about these types of stories, because again, that's where somebody, you know, they can be regarded as like the person to go see. But if you don't feel like you're going to have trust in that provider, that your communication with that provider is going to be on point, that's going to negatively catch up at some point in the treatment. So it's amazing that you listened to your gut and you were like, this is not what we're doing. So
yeah. And I've told people that I'm like, that's why, as even just like a mom of a provider and a business owner in this space, whether online education or in the private practice itself, like I like to go to providers and have a personal experience with them before I ever refer somebody, because the way you treat me, regardless of whether you know what I know or I don't know, is going to tell me a whole lot about how you're going to treat my patients I refer to you, or just moms off the internet. And I'm not referring to you just because you have a skill set. Like, I want to know that you're going to treat patients right, and you're going to respect their decisions, and they're going to have a good experience regardless of what they choose to do. And I think that's such a lost art these days. I'm like, it's such a dance between art and science that, like, if we cannot put our egos aside and remember that everybody in front of us is a human too, and we're all on our own journeys, like, you probably have no business in medicine, but that's a whole nother conversation for another day.
Agreed.
Oh, okay. So now how can they work with you? Like, what is the best way for them to find you? Tell us all the things.
Yeah. So I do have a website. It's www.oriswellness.com. And from there, there's information on there about taking the next steps. For a lot of parents, they do want to do like a initial discovery call, just because what I'm offering is pretty niche and not everyone understands whether what I'm offering sounds like what the next step is or not. So I do offer a free discovery call. That's just to kind of get a little more information. But for some families, they're like, I don't even want to spend that time. My time is so valuable that otherwise you can book straight into a consult. So there's typically for most families, it's a 60-minute consult to kind of go through all the information. And for a lot of families, that is enough to sort of get unstuck. So I do like to point that out, because I know it's like, oh, one more thing that I'm committing to, this like ongoing thing. But that's not my goal, and that's not what purpose I'm trying to serve. I'm trying to get you unstuck so that you can move forward and continue on this journey. I also have an Instagram account. So Oris.Wellness is a resource that you can follow me there and send me messages there. Those are the two biggest places. I've dabbled in some showing up on YouTube and trying to figure out some of that stuff. So to be determined as I continue to roll that out. But best way is kind of through my website. You can email me, you can contact me, schedule a call there, or catch me on Instagram.
Amazing. And we'll make sure that all of that is in the show notes so that they can find you very easily. Thank you so much. So much, Dr. Julia. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you want to like wrap up with?
No, I think the only other thing I would say is like part of what I've been enjoying doing that's been sort of incidental is a lot of the parents that have connected with me have been health providers themselves. And so one of the things that I'm trying to figure out what role I can take is sort of bridging the gap for some of the providers that are in the early stages of being curious about airway health. So for example, like a pediatrician that was focusing on anxiety and had no idea about kind of how airway health could come into the equation. I was like, well, I think you might want to consider this. And she's like, oh, I think I might have to revisit some conversations with some of my patients. So just some of the providers that are listening, if you're like just getting started in this journey and not really knowing yet, obviously there are amazing training courses and resources that you've made available and so much with your podcast. But if someone's just looking for that conversation to sort of get more information about like how they might fit into this space, I definitely welcome those conversations. That's something I'm starting to dabble with, is just how I can be a better ally to those who are wanting to dip their toes in this space too.
I love that, because I feel like we need to get more providers like into this space. And I think, like for, parents that are listening, it can be so intimidating even for providers, because we've spent so much time and energy and honing our skill set that we have now. And it sometimes just feels like, oh, another thing. And we have to do our own due diligence to figure out like, is this legit? Is this, is this the next thing? Is this where I should be going? Because when I jump into anything, these rabbit holes, like it is a rabbit hole and I am dedicated and we are going hard. So it's like when I dove into the myo space, I was like, okay, I'm here for it. And literally all of my continuing ed and courses and everything that I've done over the past 5, 6, 7, 8 years now have all been airway, TOTS, pediatric feeding. Like that is my world. And, I had to make sure before I dove into it that was where I was headed. And so, not everybody, right, is going to be in this space, and that's okay, because we need other types of specialists too in our field. But yeah, I think just understanding that like it's just as overwhelming for us getting into it when we're new as it is for you all as parents, and patients and parents of patients getting into it for your own child. So like we're all in this together. I think we all just want everyone to succeed and have healthy airways.
For sure. Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me here to chat, Hallie. It's been so fun. And again, I've been listening to your podcast for a long time, so I'm really grateful for kind of how things have progressed, that I feel like I have something to share with your audience at this point. I've learned so much from all the other guests. So thanks for kind of paying it forward.
Yeah, well, it's come full circle. So thank you for joining me. And I'm excited for us to get this out there.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this podcast. If you found value in this episode and want to hear more of these myo, TOTS, airway, and feeding related episodes, be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts and share this episode on your social media platforms. You can access free resources and all I offer at halliebalkin.com, or pop over to @HallieBalkin on Instagram to get all the latest updates.